Race and gender do play a part in our contacts with um, members of the community. For example, it's not like what you might see on TV or put out in the media that the first thing you think when you mention race and law enforcement, you think a black and white issue. That's just not correct. For an example, in my 23 years in the LA County Sheriff's Department, I've worked areas where are predominantly African American, Hispanic, Pacific Islander, or Asian. And knowing how to contact, how to deal, and how to talk to different cultures will affect my job positively or negatively. An example that I can give is like a Pacific Islander community out in our Carson area of the LA County Sheriff's Department. If you, for example, I've responded to parties where there has been a murder. And if you have a large Pacific Islander community, you don't just go and start talking to anybody and everybody. In their culture, you ask for the elder, and you go and you talk through the elder. And then you get the cooperation of the community and the remaining Pacific Islanders. Because you showed respect, you showed tradition. Now you're able to start working and interviewing and investigative effectively for that crime. That's just like with the Hispanic community. It's just like with the African American community.
Yes and no. I mean, yes in that I think there is lots of data, video, audio, written, that show that race and gender affect the way that people interact in those moments with law enforcement. You were in my class last year, and we spent most of the class kind of building off of where our country has come from in terms of race. And when you have a whole segment of society that has been, enslaved, and then over time, obviously, people aren't slaves anymore in that sense in modern America, although there are other forms that it takes on. There's still echoes of that today, and there's still echoes. I mean, all we have to do is look at the criminal justice system and the fact that, we've privatized some of the jail system, that people make money off of people being in jail, and just the large numbers of black and brown people who are in prison. I don't think that there's any particular race that has more of a propensity to being violent or to be, a criminal at all. And so what that says is that there's something inherent in our system that our officers out there in the street or the system itself almost compels people to be end up in a place where end up, and I think that comes less from law enforcement, because like I said before, I think they're doing everything they can to do the best that they can in remarkably difficult situations. I think it comes from the system that we were founded on, the echoes of where we are right now, and then the opportunities that people have growing up. And I think it all comes down to opportunity.
I believe that a person's situation, like a racial or even gender situation, could affect the way that they're viewed by police or the way people talk to them, think about them. I worked in an alternative to incarceration program with a young man who, instead of going to jail, was doing an educational program, and he had really wildly negative interactions with law enforcement in his neighborhood. He would share stories about people taking them to the precinct and beating people up, just lots of and very frequent interactions with law enforcement, and things that in his mind sometimes were justified, sometimes were unjustified. And there's I don't know if your class is looking at this, but there's and I'm blanking on, I think it's called $1 Million Blocks. It's a way of mapping who goes into jail and kind of like how and the resources it takes. But what this project shows often is that there's a disproportionate amount of resources put towards, say, black neighborhoods, and it's very clearly put out, especially if you look at like New York as an example. There's very clear examples there.
in that question, by law enforcement, no, and this is why I give this example. Certain ethnic groups, in law enforcement, we're not looking at race, color of the skin, or whatever, unless we're looking at how to communicate and deal and investigate effectively with the community. As far as giving them a bad rap, we base our resources based on crime analysis stats. Where the assaults, the robberies, the drug offenders, the murders are, and we'll put our resources in those areas. Not only suppressive crime investigative resources, but also resources to keep individuals away from crime or away from gangs. So from law enforcement, I don't believe we have put a bad reputation on any one aspect of criminals, because we're going where the statistics lie, and we're trying to solve those crimes. As far as other, I think yes, there has been over the years political statements made by certain politicians or individuals that want to go after certain factions of crime, drug or murder or assaults, whatever fancies their cause at that time for whatever post they're running for. But as law enforcement in general, in my experience, we go where the crime's at, and we go where the community needs our service the best, and that's what we do. It might not be sexy politically, but that's just the fact of what we do.
It's an interesting question of how people get reputations. Are they given by an institution, like the institution of law enforcement? Are they things that are socially pervasive, so not just unique to law enforcement? And I'm not sure. I do believe that you see minorities disproportionately kind of focused on by law enforcement. You had some questions about experience with law enforcement. My grandfather was a state police officer in New Jersey. One of my relatives now, he's a cop. He's like an assistant chief. And they say, and it's not even interesting things, is that they do take race into consideration. A story that I heard even with racial profiling in cars to try to target drug dealers or interfere with the drug trade, is that police officers will look for people of two different races, like in a car together, and then with things like fast food wrappers in the car, right? So they're being looked at in a particular way, and race is one way that the way that they're being looked at, and it's maybe in a law enforcer's, a policeman's eye, it's like, well, it's helping me do my job to get what I need, and this is actually fitting a pattern of what we see. But also, I lived in New Jersey, and racial profiling was something, a real legal issue. It was a real problem. So I see it kind of cutting both ways. But I definitely think that race is definitely something that's on people's minds as they do law enforcement.
When you first asked that question, in general, I would say your average citizen or criminal justice major or politician would say yes, and their first thing they want to go again is the black and white community and say, well, the African American community has been sentenced more harsh than any other community. Well, when you just look at the raw base FBI stats, yes, that could be considered, that is correct. But in my experience, you have to look. For example, you have a high crime area that's got a lot of murders, a lot of robberies, a lot of drugs, crime related to drugs, and we're out there trying to serve that community and get that community under control as far as to where people could walk their dog, play in the front yard, the basic things that we all take for granted in our everyday life. You might use what's called the federal resources and the federal sentencing that comes in, where you'll get harsher sentences for drugs and for possession of weapons, for murders and assaults. Those are examples. Well, that's brought in because the crime is so bad, it's not, what we're doing isn't working, and we need to do something that affects the community in a positive way. So you might see harsher sentencing in that particular community, and the other community where someone might be getting arrested for the first time isn't getting as harsh a sentence. that's where you have to break down the numbers and go, how many times is someone getting arrested before they're getting sentenced on that final arrest besides their prior arrest, if that makes any sense. You have to really break the numbers down and just go, well, this certain culture is getting sentenced longer. Well, why? Is it a higher crime area? Have they been arrested on prior occasions? Was there a federal team brought in to help bring the crime down? So, in general, I think that statistic needs to be brought down community by community and look and say, what else was going on? There's a lot of other factors that go on in sentencing.